My name is Chris Seipel, and I'm with the Institute for Global Engagement. We are grateful that you are attending today. We are grateful for the sponsorship of this event by the John Templeton Foundation. And we are grateful for social media. For those of you who like to live tweet, I'm not one of those, but you can live tweet the event at Engage Your World through IGE if you want to do that as we go. Just say nice things. For those of you who have attended this event before, this is the third in a series of four. We are essentially trying to ask the question about how we should be hard-headed and soft-hearted in a religious age. We are intentionally gathered here at the Army-Navy Club to discuss what I consider to be the essence of American exceptionalism, our soft power, our capacity to integrate others who don't look and vote and pray and act like the majority culture, not assimilate, which demands that we ask them to look like the majority culture. That's our soft power, and we're meeting here at a symbol of our conventional hard power, 1 block from the White House. And so how do you have those conversations? How do you think about how hard-headedness and soft-heartedness come together, especially when you have to, since none of us have any money anyway? We've got to be smart about these kinds of things. So that's what we're trying to do here. Today is a special, extra special day, not that the other two were not special events, but with this issue of the journal, we celebrate our 10th anniversary of 10 years of the Review of Faith International Affairs. It remains the best journal in the world because it remains the only journal in the world on these issues. And so in some ways, I think us all gathering here, and the more and more people come back a second and third time, it's almost like a therapy group, because we all get it. In some ways, we're preaching to each other's choirs, and we understand that you have to bring in religion, at least as an analytic factor on the hard power side, and hopefully as a transformative tool on the soft power side, so you can bring these worlds together. And we find solace here in this room as people who represent the broad swath of the political and theological spectrum, and that we can be here, not be in any kind of disagreements. Because I guarantee you, you disagree with everybody at your table over something politically or theologically. That's how broad the swath is. But here we are gathered to think about this as Americans, to steward this gift of citizenship where we try to integrate those who come to our country, not assimilate them. So it's the 10th anniversary of the review. We're glad that you're here to celebrate it with us, and we're glad that we have the panel that we do to celebrate the 10th anniversary and discuss faith and the 3 Ds of our current foreign policy. There is diplomacy, which you should always start with. There is development, which you should be doing anyway, but is a tangible demonstration of diplomacy and soft power. And then when all else fails, of course, there is defense, which ought to be the choice of last resort. And to talk about those things, we have Leora Denon from the State Department. She's from the CSO Bureau, the Civilian...
Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization.
The Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. And she, like the other 2 panelists, are longtime friends whom I hold dear. And she was one of the lead authors back in 2007 of the CSIS report on mixed blessings about religion and foreign policy, and de facto a thought leader on how we talk about these issues. And she will share her experiences about the State Department perspective and how she sees things with faith and foreign policy. Next, we will have Kent Hill, another dear and longtime friend who is a Russia expert, who also happens to be a former college president of 9 years, former head of the Institute for Religion and Diplomacy, former assistant administrator for Europe and Eurasia, and now with World Vision, which is very dear and near to our own Seipel family and heart, and head senior vice president here in Washington. He'll talk to you about development. And then Ken Sampson is a senior fellow over at the National Defense University. He is a colonel chaplain in the U.S. Army. He's had tours in Korea and Germany, but also 2 tours in Afghanistan and also taught out at DLI, Defense Language Institute in Monterey, suffering for the Army there. I'm a graduate of the Naval Postgraduate School, so I join him in his suffering. What an amazing experience that place is. So that's what we're trying to do. We're going to ask each panelist to speak for 10 minutes. That'll take us to about 1 o'clock. Their job is to talk about whatever they want to talk about, but in general talk about key trends or dynamics, obstacles, opportunities, but also practical recommendations about how their sphere should move forward, realizing that people are beginning to realize that religion has a role to play, at least analytically, if not transformatively. And what should we be doing to encourage that conversation to grow this luncheon out into a bigger therapy group? So with that, I will cede the floor to Ms. Leora. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the invitation. I just wanted to note that I will be speaking in an unofficial capacity so that I can speak to my observations from outside of my time in government, which is to say beyond the last 3.5, 4 months. So my views are my own and not necessarily those of the State Department or the U.S. government. We were asked to talk a bit about the way that we see U.S. religious freedom policy changing in the past decade. I've been working on issues of religion and foreign policy broadly for about the past 7 or 8 years. And really starting with when we did a study at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, looking at how the U.S. government thinks about and engages the role of religion. At that time, we found that there were 3 overarching obstacles to improved government engagement with religious factors and leaders and communities. And those 3 obstacles also happen to be alliterative, which is very convenient, the 3 C's. So first, culture, that U.S. government officials were reluctant to address the issue of religion. Second, conceptualization, that frameworks for thinking about religion were narrow. And third, capacity, that institutional capacity to think about and engage religion was limited. Since that time, it's clear to me that the culture has been and is continuing to change. Religious factors are understood to be relevant to foreign policy. And now the hard work of changing, creating the new conceptualizations, building the capacity within the department is really happening. A major part of that conceptualization work surrounds the issue of religious freedom. There's absolutely, currently and happening now, a promising movement within the U.S. government to pay increased and improved attention to religion in diplomacy. And there's no question that religious freedom has been prioritized in that. A good example is the Secretary's Working Group on Religion and Foreign Policy, which has been divided into basically 3 sub-working groups: development and humanitarian assistance, religious freedom, stability, and democracy, and conflict prevention and mitigation, categories that broadly represent U.S. goals in engaging with religion. So religious freedom is clearly prioritized here. It's on the list at an official level. But I've noticed in interviews that I've conducted in the last few years that while there's increasing recognition of the role of religion in international affairs, many officials still have questions about the role of religious freedom in that. Is religious freedom the overarching value, the principle that underlies all of our engagement with faith-based actors and the backbone of efforts to prevent violent conflict and promote democracy? Or is it a subfield within the religion umbrella, something good to keep an eye on? For those who see religious freedom as the starting point, there's also a valid tactical question. Do we better promote religious freedom by elevating existing mechanisms and terminology, or do we better turn to new vocabulary, approaches, and bureaucratic systems? My sense is there's room for an improved conversation about religious freedom promotion in 2 broad areas that I'm generally going to categorize as 1, internal messaging, and 2, external messaging, and 2, internal mainstreaming. So first with messaging, I think there's a lot of room for more creative thinking to be done both about how we expand and contextualize the way we talk about religious freedom. A couple of years ago, I did a fellowship for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, looking at ways to promote religious freedom as America's greatest soft power, a concept that I, of course, borrowed from Chris. With this strategy, religious freedom is understood to be central to global engagement in today's most important strategic issues. Officials should therefore be able to communicate the role of religion in American public life, dispel misperceptions about religious freedom policy abroad, and promote the benefits of increased religious freedom in countries overseas. Both the content and the methods of this messaging are important. Content will need to address real concerns about current religious freedom policy. I found in my research that concerns included that this policy somehow defied the separation of church and state, that it constituted a form of cultural imperialism, that it protected only Christians, or that it somehow overstated U.S. legitimacy on this issue. More scholarly and policy attention should be given to addressing those concerns, as well as to promoting research and data that shows the social value of religious freedom, how it's linked with economic development and democratic stability, and its absence correlated with violent extremism and conflict. We can also think more creatively about types of methods we use to engage this message. The tools of public diplomacy, I argue, are ideally suited to this type of soft power approach that really encourages mutual exchange. I found many examples of public diplomacy programs that were able to promote religious freedom by engaging unexpected and credible voices, employing creative media to really increase awareness, and incorporating religious freedom issues into both traditional exchange programs and newer social media type exchanges. Of course, the external messaging is only one component. There's also theoretical and practical work to be done in mainstreaming religious freedom with other foreign policy priorities to help to integrate the issue more seamlessly across the bureaucracy. As an example of this type of effort, I'm going to tell you a bit about our bureau, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, and what we've done to incorporate thinking about religious freedom into our work on conflict prevention and mitigation. So CSO is a new bureau launched by Secretary Clinton as part of an effort to transform the way that the department operates in conflict zones, transitioning from a focus on post-conflict reconstruction to a new era in conflict prevention and stabilization, and recognizing the need to really build civilian capacity in those places. Our official mission statement is to advance U.S. national security by breaking cycles of violent conflict and mitigating crises in priority countries. Our business model focuses on three key capabilities: data-driven conflict analysis, strategic planning to target the causes of instability, particularly during moments of high risk like political transitions or elections, and when appropriate, on-the-ground engagements to amplify locally driven initiatives. We believe that in any case where religion matters, those three lines of effort are more likely to be successful if we engage religious actors. We have a few overarching principles in thinking about that type of engagement. The first is that while much attention has been paid to religion's role in violence, religious networks are most often sources of resilience and activism, regardless of whether the conflict falls along religious lines. Second, the diverse range of religious actors matter in conflict mitigation, not just those who have been traditionally seen as leaders. Third, that prevention of violent conflict requires freely operating religion, as religious leaders are most likely to contribute positively in places where they're actually able to work, and given that we have empirical evidence showing that religious restrictions correlate with indicators of conflict. And finally, that we must connect with deep expertise on context-specific issues, which includes engaging local actors and local religious actors in front-end analysis and not just as potential program implementers. Depending on the context, there may be opportunities to engage at various levels. Top-down efforts might include increasing the capacity of a host nation government to work with their local religious civil society, including an improved orientation toward religious freedom. Middle-out approaches could look at ways that we would connect religious networks or amplify faith-based campaigns, and bottom-up approaches would be promoting community resilience, working on grassroots efforts through religious congregations or schools to help both in early warning, conflict prevention, and strategic communications, and then when violence does occur, in first response effort, humanitarian aid, and other work like that. Our current engagements give a few examples of how this works. For example, in the lead up to the Kenyan elections this past month, CSO has been working to counter political manipulation and strengthen early warning and response. We found religious leaders to be natural partners because of their credibility and their reach into communities, including through religious sermons and messaging. In particular, CSO has been working with a number of Catholic bishops who have raised election awareness and responded to tensions with messages of nonviolence. In Honduras, which now has the world's highest murder rate outside of a war zone, CSO is working to reduce crime levels and increase government responsiveness. CSO's primary partner there is a coalition including many faith-based civil society groups. We're also promoting the development of public messaging to help transform the national narrative to one of empowerment and hope. And in that work, we've really been actively trying to learn from influential priests and pastors in the country about the types of messages that they are finding actually work with those they're trying to reach, how they see the security problem, trying to get a better sense of what they see as the underlying causes of conflict and what should be done. And a final example, in Syria, CSO has been helping to train and equip the nonviolent opposition, and we've worked primarily from Turkey to distribute thousands of pieces of equipment and to offer training in civil administration, communications, countering sectarian violence, and crisis management, all with the primary goal to build a network that is ethnically and religiously diverse. We're also supporting a Syrian-led strategic communications center that, among other efforts, has worked to disseminate mass messages of religious inclusion. One example is a broadcast they did between Christian and Muslim residents of homes talking about how they would work to rebuild religious sites that had been destroyed by regime forces. In all of these engagements, religious liberty has been relevant, sometimes subtly, sometimes more explicitly, as it has been in work that we've done elsewhere, Belize, Senegal, Burma. Moving forward, we think that one approach to furthering this work is developing signature initiatives that showcase the resilience of religious communities or highlight the ways that interreligious collective action can help to build peace. As much as anything else, doing that kind of initiative can help to bring attention to the work within the department and elevate and continue to change the culture there. We're also looking at training as a way to mainstream engagement. There's great training that came into place at FSI that we were just discussing. We specifically wanted to address the issue of how to reach officials beyond those who would sign up for a 4-day voluntary, non-mandatory course that's being offered at FSI. So we're funding development of an interactive, scenario-based modules that could be integrated across mainstream training. The creation of training materials in particular really highlights how much work is still to be done in making the real academic practitioner links. Translation work is needed on both sides to make the best of academic thinking accessible to practitioners and to connect it to the real questions that practitioners are facing. Of course, IGE and the Review of Faith International Affairs have done so much to make those connections, and particularly this journal, I think, does a great job at that intersection. But there's so much other scholarly work out there that might help us to answer some of today's most important questions on these issues, and I'll put a few of them out there. What qualities make religion distinct? How is our understanding and engagement as U.S. officials affected by our own biases and frameworks? How can we better understand the way that the U.S. is perceived on religion-related factors, particularly where it might exacerbate conflict? How can we talk about religious freedom in context-relevant ways? And how do we think about the balance between individual religious freedom and communal religious identity and pluralism? How involved should the U.S. government be in the evolving relationship between religion and state in other countries? I'm very grateful that IGE has been moving forward on that discussion between the religious, scholarly, and practitioner communities, and I know that the State Department really welcomes the ongoing conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Ken.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to be here. I think I was at USAID in 2002 when I saw the National Security Council's new strategic policy, which for the first time listed the 3 Ds. And as I recall reading it and giving speeches on it, it was defense, diplomacy, and development. Back then, the big news was that one of the Ds was development at all. Normally, people didn't talk about development very much as a critical component of national security. And I like the way you've subtly changed, not so subtly, changed the order to diplomacy, development, and defense. Maybe the next time we meet it will be development, you know. But I'm sure what they were thinking in 2002, they were listing it in the order of the amount of money in the budget for the 3 items. So what I would like to do in the little bit of time I have with you today is to address 2 questions. One, I want to make the empirical case that the evidence is absolutely overwhelming for the importance of religion and religious freedom in dealing with international development. And in fact, I'm going to give some evidence in a few minutes from Jean Duff, who is sitting right down here, and I'm going to propagandize one of these, a wonderful project that she's involved with, which makes precisely this case. And then the second part of what I'm going to do has 2 parts. It has to do with what the challenges are to faith-based NGOs in doing their work in the developing world. And there will be 2 challenges. One is external challenges from working in difficult contexts sometimes, which make it difficult for religious actors, whether they're Islamic Relief or World Vision or whomever they are. If they have a religious convictions that are different from the majority culture, that can be a challenge. But the second challenge I want to spend a few moments on is increasing challenges to the doing of that work from within the host country. And I'm going to talk about some who would like to narrow the tent and exclude religious players from the public expenditure of funds that deal with promoting the common good abroad. So just a few words about the first point. I said I was going to mention some remarkable work that Jean Duff has done. This is worth taking a kind of a mental note of, because I would predict that over the next few months, the best empirical evidence that's being gathered on this is being gathered by an initiative that she is the coordinator for, which is called the Joint Learning Initiative on the Role of Faith in Local Communities. And although it says "and local communities," that can read sort of "and, you know, international development." And what's interesting about this group, about 70 groups are involved, both secular and religious, who are convinced that religion and religious NGOs have a major role to play in international development. But this is such a diverse group that includes groups like the Office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Islamic Relief, Samaritan's Purse, Cheer Fund, UNAIDS, UNFPA, and World Vision. So that's quite a spectrum of religious and secular folks. And here's the important thing. The preliminary results that these folks are coming up together makes absolutely clear that this is critically important, that we take seriously that connection between religious and religious players in doing this work. Now, I'm only going to have a chance to just touch the surface on some things that Jean presented to that group at World Vision just this past week. But listen to these statistics. And by the way, all of these are footnoted very carefully by Jean in her presentation. But 75% of Africans report that religious leaders are the people they trust most. There are 100,000 faith-inspired organizations working on health and development in Africa. Less than 1% of them are international NGOs. Christian health networks account for between 30 and 60% of all health services in African countries. The Global Fund has concluded that this resource, the faith-based organizations, are underutilized. There is just a whole host of statistics like that which make the case that you would be crazy to take on international development without inviting into the tent those who have the networks on the ground in these places to actually do the work. I'm going to skip over a lot of the things I had typed up to share with you, but that's the first assertion, the empirical assertion that you've got to deal with religion, you've got to deal with religious FBOs if you're going to successfully do the development work for the common good. I want to go to the challenges to faith-based groups, international NGOs, local NGOs who want to do their work to try to promote the common good. The first challenge, of course, is that you could run into problems in the field in a host country. My specialty was Eastern Europe and Russia, and I can remember the days when, by the Constitution of Albania, you weren't allowed to believe in God. At least in the Soviet Union, you were allowed to believe in God, you just weren't allowed to practice it very much. But so whenever you're an FBO, and you're trying to work in a context like that, can be difficult. Or if you're in an Orthodox setting, after the coming down of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, faith-based organizations that were not Orthodox did not necessarily meet with open arms by the Orthodox in a place like Russia or Ukraine or other places where that was the case. Or you would expect the situation to be in certain Muslim context countries and places where you have a fundamental violation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which would say that all people have the right to change their religious beliefs. In a setting like that, if an NGO comes in representing another faith tradition, they could have a very difficult time. Now, obviously, and of course there's the debate over proselytism. We don't have time to talk about that here, except to say that often the definition is problematic. But the point is, a majority religion will often view even the presence of a religiously inspired group as sheep stealing. And so that can make it very difficult for them to do their work, even if it's giving inoculations and dealing with polio. I think, and the journal has argued from the very beginning, that religious freedom is a very important part of human development. I found this last issue, the one you're celebrating today, to be remarkable. One of the assertions made in there that I think there's ample evidence to support is the notion that if you're in the State Department and you want to have some sense of how problematic a country is going to be, take a look at where they fall on the Religious Freedom Index. There's a clear correlation between a country that grants religious freedom and one that does not. To the extent it is abridged, there's going to be a problem in a whole host of other areas. It seems to be the canary in the mine that will tell you if something's going desperately wrong in that society that could be a very big problem. So you can be a hardened atheist and agnostic and understand the empirical evidence that would suggest religion matters, and whether there is freedom for religious believers will tell you a lot about the possibilities of democracy, how they're going to interact with others, and etc. Let me move on, and I'm going to conclude with sort of the more controversial part of what I have to say, in the sense that it's not the thing we usually think about when we talk about religious freedom. A lot of religious freedom experts are arguing that quite a surprise nowadays. Some of the religious freedom challenges and freedom of conscience challenges are occurring in our own backyard in Western democracies. And I'm going to give you 3 ways in which sometimes you see this sort of thing. When I was in the Bush administration in charge of global health, I was in charge of the PEPFAR programs that USAID administered. So I knew very much about the controversy over the so-called ABC strategy in implementing how you deal with prevention of HIV/AIDS. ABC, abstinence, be faithful, and condoms. And that gave me the unenviable task of making sure that both the left and the right was always opposed to what I was trying to do. The left and the folks who didn't like religious actors being involved in the PEPFAR space said, what does the U.S. government have the right to do? They shouldn't, in fact, promote giving money to faith-based organizations who even talk about sexual behavior. That's a moral issue. That's not something we ought to fund. On the other hand, the religious right was attacking me for giving out more condoms than anybody else on earth, which I had to confess was true. That's what I did. But the point on this is the perspective that if a religious actor is involved, and in some way what they're doing, even if it's in the name of public health, because it's just an empirical fact that sexual behavior has something to do with the spread of HIV/AIDS, and any time that behavior was successfully challenged, the HIV prevalence rates went down. But there were charges during those years that the U.S. government ought not to give any money to anybody who talked about sexual behavior, particularly if they had religious motivations. Now, we argued that we gave money to faith healers and prostitutes groups and religious groups, letting them all make their arguments in their own ways, as long as the final result would be a change in behavior, and change in behavior might be to use a condom, by the way, not just what you do, if it would bring down the prevalence rate of HIV/AIDS. Let me give you a second example that's very, very current, and it's the debate over gay marriage. What does the debate over gay marriage have to do with international foreign assistance and foreign and FBOs who do international development work with taxpayer dollars? Here's what it is. There are more and more calls that faith-based organizations should not be allowed to receive taxpayer dollars if they have a view which is considered discriminatory by the LGBT community. What would be viewed as discriminatory? Holding a traditional view that marriage is between a man and a woman and that sexual relations ought to occur within the context of marriage between a man and a woman. Now, what's interesting about this is the notion that the Big Ten approach to U.S. foreign policy, that you would give money to a whole series of people who often disagree with each other, is challenged fundamentally by this. But the very notion that you have to hold the right views, that what might be considered politically correct or the progressive way to think at a given moment, if you don't hold those views, you can't do work with taxpayer dollars, is a very dangerous idea, fundamentally undermining the, I would say, it fundamentally undermines American pluralism, which says there's plenty of room in the public square for people who differ, religious, not sure, and all sorts of religion, to participate in promoting the common good. And let me give you a third example, and then I will end with this. We can talk perhaps in more detail about some of these things if you are interested afterwards. Think about the debate over family planning and contraception. I've been in the health field for a long time. And if you're interested in maternal and child health, and you're interested in keeping the size of the family lower for a variety of reasons, there are all sorts of methods, obviously, that you can use. And among those methods, of course, are contraception, which the Catholic Church or Catholic aid agencies would not want to do. They are willing to do all sorts of other things. I talk about natural family planning, birth spacing, and do 1,000 other things, and they are the major player in the field on many of these cases. If you write a U.S. government grant in a way that says you will do all of these things, what it's really designed to do is exclude from participating those who cannot do one of those things. And so Congress and USAID has continually addressed the question of ought there be a conscience clause, which says that a group which can do something that will promote the public good should not be required to do everything. Let somebody else do the other things, etc. It's a small thing, but it's a big thing because it will either let in or let out of the tent that does the public good those who might have differences of opinion. So this issue is hot. The voices are getting louder, which want to exclude those with whom they disagree. And so ironically, the role of religious freedom in doing international development work actually is played out in part in internal U.S. discussions about who's going to have access to taxpayer dollars. All the evidence suggests that over the next months and years, these are going to be the hot issues. I think what's at stake, by the way, is American pluralism, religious freedom, and freedom of conscience. If these kind of ideas had been current a number of decades ago, the Amish would never have the sort of special treatment that they have on occasion. It's a different time than we faced a few years ago. And I've been one that's always argued for the Big Tent approach, both because it empirically keeps at the table and involve those who can help us do the work, but also because it fundamentally supports the First Amendment. And, you know, the First Amendment talks about not establishing religion or interfering with the free exercise thereof. Ironically, the source of the challenge to religious freedom today comes from those who would violate the first part of the religious freedom, First Amendment, by establishing a religion. It doesn't happen to be a religion, it happens to be a secular ideology. But we should reject it whether it's a secular ideology or a particular religious ideology which is established in the United States, and continue to vote for American pluralism and religious freedom. So, thank you.
Mike?
I do. Thank you very much, Chris, for being able to be a part of this distinguished panel. I speak for myself as a practitioner, as a chaplain. I'm not speaking for the Department of Defense at large, although I'm kind of taking a strategic view. But I also would like to recognize my colleagues who are here, at least three that I know. There are others maybe, but anyway, Chaplain Dan Ames, who's with the he's the Joint Force Chaplain. He works in the Pentagon. He's the guy who's on General Dempsey's, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He's the chaplain that goes on his staff. He has just come from the Center for World Religions down at Fort Jackson for Army chaplains. He was over in Iraq quite recently, so he knows the stuff, what's going on as far as religious engagement with Iraq. Then Chaplain Vic, who's his deputy over there, also he has a lot from Anglican perspectives and world perspectives. Then we have Chaplain David Bynum, who's a Navy chaplain, who just came from Afghanistan prior to coming to be a student at our National War College. So he has that experience, and also at a tactical level, that's at the low level of being in Southwest Asia or Southeast Asia, and a lot of good interactions that have occurred. So questions, you can get something there. I'm trying to be a good soldier. I was given, as I read it, I see kind of three areas to address. And one are what's the strengths, weaknesses, and trends that have to do with this whole matter of religious freedom, international religious freedom. That's the first one. I think with myself, I would say that there is an awakening which is occurring. An awakening. When we have the national security staff, these are the folks who are the big people in government, the representatives, that national security staff that has a chaplain that has chaplain interests in what's going on with religious engagement around the world. That's unheard of, in my judgment. I've been working with world religions for, let's see, since '96, so almost 20 years. And it's just, to have the deputy chief of Army chaplains attend a national security staff thing and say, hey, what's going on in religious engagement that your chaplains and your folks, that is significant. That is significant. I think to have, as Leora here from the State Department with this conflict resolution operations, and to have religion be a part of that center is significant. I see that as a real awakening compared to 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. So awakening there. Second, I see as a weakness with this international religious freedom, and I know this is, please kind of hear me out on this, but I'm looking at it as from a strategic perspective and also as a practitioner. Are we reconcilers or are we dividers? That is the question I know Senator John Danforth gave to us in his book. Are we reconcilers or are we dividers? I really have difficulty when I see the reports and I hear, just in a media setting, or it gets to this, what are we doing as far as getting across our message? But when the message I always seem to hear is, it's like a policeman given a ticket. Religious freedom, it's America telling the world how you should act. I just, engagement is the way that we are doing our work as chaplains, at least that I've been involved with. We engage with these religious leaders. We engage with them, and by our example, we show what religious freedom is all about. I cannot go to Afghanistan, Mullah Momin, who's there in Bagram Parwan province, and say to him, you know, you don't get religious freedom around here. I'm not going to, how can we, I just can't do that. But I can engage and I can model and I can bring I can bring chaplains together from, or literally around the world, from different faiths, different perspectives, from even humanist perspectives come together. Show, so that's modeling. So that's a reconciler divider. And then I think our partnership with our State Department, I think we can do some more in that area of how we engage with our religious leaders on the ground. And here I am, a chaplain. I'm there for a year. I'm there for 6 months. The State Department is there for a while longer, provide continuity. If I could engage with the State Department, then I'd have a lot of good stuff over time, over 10 years, that we'd be able to go and benefit from over time. Trends, this is really a trend which I can't get over. Our Secretary of Defense, he spoke at National Defense University about 2 weeks ago. He was responding to a question from one of our students, and he said, he really got energized. It was a one time in that whole speech, he got energized, and the question had to do about what are we doing for interagency partnerships? And he said, you know, as we see the defense and information and military, what is it, dime, we got dollars and information and military and economics, diplomacy, yeah. In the armed forces, you got this diplomacy, information, military, and economics. But when Secretary of Defense Hagel says, this interagency association working together in limited constraints is where I see the next 5 or the next 10 or 15 years as being where we must go. And he got energized by it. So I see kind of this, it's part of this awakening that we can have these partnerships, that we can embrace, literally embrace our friends in different agencies. So that's religious freedom. What about scholarly policy literature? I would say we need to be able to celebrate what has gone on the last 10 years. Celebrate what has gone on the last 12 months. When Secretary of State Hillary Clinton gave her talk on religious freedom at Carnegie thing in July of 2012, and she talked so much about religious freedom as a valve, a safety valve for terrorism, that was to me significant. When President Obama went down to Burma at Yangon University, I believe, and gave a talk that had this religious dimension and what religious engagement is about, that was significant. I think when you have like a guy like Ibo Patel and this inter-religious core, youth core, where you have these college campuses from a broad perspective that are coming together. They don't care what your religion. They're interested in what can we do on the ground. Action. Wow, that to me is celebration. I think you could look in the scholarly literature. It seems to me like there's an explosion. Wow. Here I am, an Army person, using a term that many of my Catholic sisters, some of these Catholic sisters don't even use. I'm not talking about explosion. I don't want to take a. But anyway, there's a great increase in scholarly work, and scholarly activity as I look around the country. It seems. Then. Engagement. The CENTCOM commander is a 4-star general officer named Lloyd Austin. CENTCOM is the Central Command. It's down in Florida. General Austin, he took over command about 5-6 weeks ago. I served with him second time in Afghanistan. General Austin has responsibility for the Middle East theater. I would see him at the gym to do PT. He'd do PT there at Fort McNair. I'd see him every once in a while. Well, I'd see him a couple times a week. I sent General Austin a book when I found out he was going down to CENTCOM. And that book was by Daniel Philpott, Just and Unjust Peace. Now that was a significant thing, because Philpott in that book, he describes about how we can have reconciliation, how we can use alternative means to look at justice. And to be able to give a book like that, although it was theoretical, and I said, have your chaplain or have one of your staff members read this, and I didn't want him to read it. But the concepts there were concepts which could bring about, in my judgment, some reconciliation, even with the Taliban that's going on there. And based upon using some of the strengths that we find in our religious traditions. Tremendous thing, engagement. Trends then that are going on. I think there's a bipartisan international religious freedom appeal that in the last year or 2 years seems to be taking place, where we're looking at international religious freedom. What are the United Nations documents? What are these? We're drawn from that. It's a good trend. Recommendations for future government actors. I think a sense of convergence, build upon what is going on with these partnerships. I think we're at a very unique place for that. A plan. I was at this Catholic University 2 weeks ago, looking back at Pacem in Terris 50 years ago. So here's this papal encyclical that Pope John the 23rd gave 50 years ago. What does it look like now 50 years afterward? If you were back in 1963 looking at that papal encyclical, you'd say, Pope John, I think you're taking too much of the communion wine here. This thing looks to me like something that'll be, it's just too idealistic. It's too in the clouds. Please, I didn't mean that, the communal wine. I was, I thought he was smoking dope or something like that. I'm sorry about my communion wine thing. Anyway, so there you 50 years ago, it comes at, you would say that it's too idealistic, but when you look at the incremental steps that have been taken, there's been significant positive stuff that's gone on in our world. Where is our plan with religious freedom? I know we have a lot of articles, a lot of things, but where's our plan where this partnership, where we can look at some incremental steps? I just throw that out. And then I have some things for Institute of Global Ethics, but global engagement, but my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, join me in thanking the three panelists for some excellent presentations. I'm going to ask Corey, our designated microphone guy, to come up and get the microphone if he's around. There he is. This is Corey Bender. He does Central Asia for the Institute for Global Engagement. You need to meet him. He's a mover and shaker and a microphone guy today at a small nonprofit. By way of the briefest of summaries, then I'd like to open the floor up to you guys to hear your thoughts and or recommendations, because most of you, if not all of you, could be up here in the panel too. There's a lot of wisdom in this room, and I'd love to hear from it. Here's the bottom line. Religion's real. You can't ignore it. Second is, on the negative side, it's a canary in the mines. It's an indicator of when things go wrong. On the positive side, though, it's an indicator of how to contribute to a flourishing society and the common good, perhaps under a broader rubric of what it means to be a citizen. That said, it is a fluid time as this idea takes hold and as a paradigm shifts. And I thought Leora's 3 C's, I'm a big fan of alliteration, were very helpful, which ought to be applied across the 3 Ds, which were the culture, the concept, and the capacity. In your sphere, diplomacy, development, or defense, what is the culture, concept, and capacity to engage religion? Not as a panacea, but nor as the singular problem. To include it as a legitimate analytic factor, hard power, and allow for the transformative effect it can have on a heart. A conflict not transformed is a conflict transferred. And so we also need to think about what this means for us back in the United States. And I thought Kent was very helpful here. It is a fluid moment on the issue itself, but the issue itself is a reflection of who we are as a people and our identity. And will we have a big tent for all perspectives, all the time, all faiths and none? And three questions result from that. One is, how do we institutionalize this in the U.S. government? Which comes back to capacity in your sphere. How do we deal with the reality of religion? The new number is 84% of the world believes in something greater than themselves. Brian Grimm. The second question is this, which I think is more fascinating. You can build structures and build platforms. Who stewards the relationships? You have the same religious leaders in these countries, traditional and non-traditional, men and women. And the Americans keep showing up and keep rotating through. Who stewards the relationship so that there's a commonality there and a touchstone of trust? The Americans are coming, but they've been briefed right this time. And the last piece, which I think speaks to Ken's point about strategy and the 50-year perspective, this is a 2-cent unsolicited opinion, but I'm offering it anyway. We have lost the capacity to do grand strategy as a country. And grand strategy, if you understand what that means, is how all the elements of national power, governmental and non-governmental, come together to work in times of peace, to preserve it in order to prevent war, but to win it when it comes. And we're just not very good at that. And that's why Secretary of Defense Hagel and the call for partnerships is so key. We need new types of partnerships and new culture that can think across these bureaucratic boundaries and conceptual ones. So with that, let's open the floor. We're going to go to about 1:45 or so, and then we'll be adjourned. But who would like to have the first question or suggestion? And I ask that you keep things short so we can get everybody's opinions and take good notes.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for a really wonderful set of presentations that gave us a lot to think about. It's hard to come to just one question, so I'll try to slip in two. On the question of soft power, I think it's interesting to note, I'm thinking specifically of Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey, the comments he made to the Muslim Brotherhood last year, in which he talked about secularism and defended secularism in a way, and described it in a way, and he's done this elsewhere, because the term secularism is often misunderstood, especially in the Middle East. It's seen as the European model of chasing religion out of the public square, whereas the United States, we have I think, a significantly different understanding of secularism, where it has to do more with the government really taking a position on one religion over another. And even though I think I and many others probably have criticisms of Mr. Erdogan, I think he was correct in this, in stressing this. I'm wondering how you think engaging with these countries and kind of supporting and trying to cultivate a sense of secularism in that sense is undermined by some of the debates we've been having here in the United States. I am thinking specifically like the Park 51, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque and all of that. I think, in my view, as someone who kind of studies this sort of Islamophobia, it seems to have crested, thankfully. Or to take another view is the fact that we are engaging in a debate over this so vigorously, just another sign of the strength of our democracy. And is that another form of soft power? And just to add very, very quickly on your point about about grand strategy, I wonder, especially in the wake of the Boston bombings, in terms of coming to a consensus about American strategy, what we should do in times of peace to prevent war, it seems that we haven't really agreed whether we're at war or not. And this is a debate that has been re-enlivened by what happened in Boston. So,
Thank you. Anyone want to take on? Leora?
I mean, I'll just quickly respond. Yes, I think it's relevant. I think that's why a public diplomacy approach, and one that encourages mutual exchange, is the right kind of approach here, because those things do exist, and we do have examples of religious freedom violations in the U.S., and I would advocate for a warts and all approach where we're willing to discuss those things, but at the same time to show the successes that our system does have, and there are many, and show that while we have our failings and we have weaknesses, that we are willing to be forthcoming about, and debates that are being had, that we also have a system that in many ways has worked better, resulted in less violence along religious lines, and less repression and persecution than in other places, and that full message should be given so that we have that kind of credibility that we've lost in some places. I think that actually one of the journal articles here had a good categorization on the point you were just making about the European versus U.S. model, which is the distinction between secularism and secularity, is what Brett Sharps refers to. That this idea that our system is about religion, freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. And I think that that's exactly the type of nuance and conversation that State Department officials, people who are working with international audiences, should be trained really to talk about and engage in, and that we're not quite there yet.
Let me just add something. I think it's a good point to mention that the debate about secularism itself is really critical. And there are a whole host of intellectual historians who've written books on the history of secularism particularly since the French Revolution, etc. But it's tremendously important that we pay attention to definitions and what we mean by them. And they're disputed terms. There would be some who would interpret secularism to be a kind of an establishment of secular views as the public views, as opposed to secularism as defending a pluralistic environment which religious and non-religious players can all be involved. And so it's important to think this through and talk about it. When we were growing up, if you'd asked an average person, are you for religious freedom? The answer is, of course, yes. So you don't even bother to explain why you're for religious freedom or freedom of conscience, etc. I think we've reached the point now that we need to rethink and be able to argue again why religious freedom is not just one of many freedoms, but the substantial freedom for a human being, why it's so important. That's why what the Berkeley Center is doing at Georgetown with Tom Farr and Tim Shaw is so critically important, the Religious Freedom Project, which also is being funded by the Templeton Foundation. But the proposition behind that is that, in fact, we have to regain an ability to discuss the importance of religious freedom and why it matters for a democracy. You can't assume that people just grow up with it and will understand it. So we need to think very hard about these things and have civil discussion about them if we hope for them to survive.
I'll just add one thing about just how the discussion has gone, because it was one of the issues I thought maybe we might want to look at. Institute of Global Engagement. The Constitution, if you work for government in the United States, there's no requirement for religion or religious preference religion, Article 6 of the Constitution says, you know, you can have a religious faith or you can have none. And that's a dimension which I think needs to be at least brought into the conversation.
We know that religious leaders are authentic voices in their communities. So how can we seek to engage these religious leaders for conflict resolution? How do we keep it as religious engagement, not political engagement with religious leaders?
Let me take a stab at that because that's a terrific question. You know, one of the problems I think we've inherited in international relations is that we think the only arguments we can make for resolving a dispute are sort of secular arguments that are just fine in many respects. I mean, peace is going to be better for your children. You know, you can't continue to do this, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, once a conflict has really been around for a while, generations or centuries, and the bitterness and the anger is there, any historian will tell you that the role of irrational behavior becomes almost unbeatable. I mean, the desire for revenge will trump any enlightened argument for the next generation. You're just so mad, you really want to take revenge. You ask what kind of force has the capacity to take on that kind of anger? And of course, we all know that religion can be a force in fueling all this. Religion abused is a source of problems. But religion can play a positive role. And sometimes when you're dealing with that, and two sides, maybe two different religions even, if you can get the two sides to be willing to talk about the best their religion may have to offer, whether it's Muhammad or Christ, and to challenge people who say they are believers in Muhammad or Christ, to take seriously something within the religion that's not being paid attention to now, that is a powerful argument with those folks than an argument you or I might make from outside. So the point is not to come in and make those arguments for them, but to create a forum in which the best of the religious leadership can play a role, whether it's Ireland or Bosnia or someplace in Northern Africa, Israel, someplace where you set a forum where people can use some of the most powerful arguments that exist from within a religious tradition. Often it's most effective when you get two religious traditions who are at odds making an argument, say, we really can find common ground here. I'll give you an example I heard just this week. I was in Chicago over the weekend, heard the story about a World Vision national director in Mauritania, which is an Islamic republic. After 9/11, tensions were high, and an Islamic radical pulled out a pistol and shot the national director from World Vision and his 10-year-old daughter. So the question was whether World Vision would pull out of Mauritania. And for some reason, these folks felt compelled to stay. And after they were treated in Paris, they came back to Mauritania. They were greeted at the airport by the Muslim leadership of Mauritania, who were so touched that they were willing to come back, continue their development work. And they eventually went to the prison and saved the person's life because only the victim can stop an execution. They were going to execute this guy. The impact of that living out, in this case of a Christian faith of forgiveness, had the most powerful impact bringing the Muslims and Christians together. And the national director made this very interesting testimony. When his wife was asked to go to the countryside outside the capital in Mauritania and to meet with some Muslim women, everybody was a little frightened. But these Muslim women were there to comfort and help her through this time of great grieving over what had happened to her daughter. The same thing happened for the national director. And they basically said it was Muslims who helped us recover from an act of hatred. So, I mean, these kind of things can bring interreligious peace or at least reconciliation if we're willing to live out our faith. So we need to look for opportunities to break what would be the normal behavior, which is what you might get if you're only using secular reasoning. So find a way to attract the best of a religious tradition, whether it's Muslim, Christian, Jewish, whatever, and that could be the way forward in dealing with a conflict situation.
I would just add quickly, our Assistant Secretary for CSO, Rick Barton, talks about how he travels the world, going to all these conflict zones with really varying issues, and he'll see that the U.S. government agencies or offices operating there are all bringing the same programs that they're doing in every other place? And how can you have all these different kinds of problems, but they all somehow need exactly the same solution? And I think there's a tendency to come up with an approach, and then this is what we're coming in with, and then we'll see how religious leaders or faith-based organizations might have the capacity to carry out the ideas that we're coming in with. And the principle of a locally driven engagement, I think really the key thing is to engage religious leaders and communities in the front-end analysis so that we're thinking about ways that we're continually changing our own frameworks and not just coming in with the same categories and ideas and programs.
And I would say real quickly, the last chapter in the Rutledge Handbook of Religion and Security talks about, which is global engagement sponsored, talks about Chaplain Mike Hoyt doing that engagement in Iraq in 2006, 2007, and he addresses that very question much in the way that Kent has responded.
Hi, I'm Steve Glick with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. First of all, just a word of gratitude for the focus on conscience. That's critically important for our church to do what it does well in so many places. But my question is, it's very heartening that the State Department is getting religion. I mean, really getting it better, right? But there's also a danger there. And so my question would be, how can the State Department and our government work in smart ways that preserve the independence of religious actors in order to preserve their credibility in the populations where they are trusted?
I think that's a great question. It's one for probably mutual conversation to be had about what are the concerns on all sides. I think that there's a movement to have an increased sense of where it's appropriate for the U.S. government to really take the lead and where we shouldn't, where our imprint should be and where others should have play a more appropriate role. So I don't know, I would be happy to open that up to broader thoughts.
I was just going to suggest that the instrumentalism that you are referencing, Steve, is what is warned against in this report. By the way, they're right next to yours, Leora, on the syllabi, is the Chicago Council's report. It's under policy recommendations from think tanks.
Who headed that up, Rich?
Anyway, the Chicago Council reports, as I presume yours, I'll read yours, warns against that kind of instrumentalism. So it's a tough question. Thank you, Steve. My follow-up is to say the Chicago Council investigation over 2 years came up with one program with Islamic leaders that was then defunded. Actually, it became a negative illustration by the State Department, defunding of a program that was actually funded by the U.S. government to do the kind of engagement that we were then recommending in the report. So my question, since the report is now 2 years down the road, what has the Obama administration done with it? Post-Cairo speech, or any of these other policy recommendations by Tom Farr, Dennis Hoover, et cetera, along these lines? Because absent funding, which I know nobody has anything of, that's always the excuse, there's no money. Absent funding, these programs go wanted.
I think to both of these questions, this is definitely in process. And I think that the Secretary's Working Group on Religion and Foreign Policy, which was part of the strategic dialogue with civil society, was a good example of the type of effort that the State Department is trying to do in terms of saying, hey, we don't know all the answers. We know that we need a partnership with outside organizations. In fact, we have defense over here saying, well, we need as the State Department to be doing these long-term relationships because we're in and out. Well, the State Department is counting on Chris, actually, and ICRD and other organizations that really are doing the long-term work. And what we've tried to do now is to create these mechanisms that bring the scholars, the faith-based organizations, the religion experts to really inform, act as a committee of experts and expertise that's informing the work that we do. I do think, as I tried to emphasize, one of the few overarching principles that we're really trying to promote is to to not approach engagement with religious leaders and communities with that kind of instrumentalist attitude, but to instead think about ways that we're engaging religious leaders as experts, as informing our conflict analysis, thinking about the ways that they see security and violence problems, what they see as the potential solutions, and more as partners. So I think that that shift in culture is happening. It's still increasingly needed, and that's a space where the kind of partnership conversation can help.
Jean, you had a question?
Thanks so much, and thanks to Kent for highlighting this work that the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities is doing in relation to evidence. Your 3 C's were being cleverly then reapplied to the 3 Ds by Chris, my mind was moving along exactly the same lines. And recalling that the folks who have shaped this Joint Learning Initiative, several UN agencies, some of the largest international faith-based charities, major academic institutions, religious bodies, came together over a several-year period to discuss this question of the interface between, in this case, development-oriented religious bodies and secular society, and the problems, the persistent problems that related to the failure to fully engage religious assets, if you like, broadly read across the board. And this particular group of folks who were expert in this area, both secular, mind you, and faith-based, decided that the focal point of their joint activity would be around the question of evidence. Could we produce reputable, scientifically credible evidence that would stand up, that related to the activity of faith communities in development and related to their contributions to development? And so underway now is this international learning community-driven collaboration that's organized thematically around several areas. One of them is in the area of resilience, and you spoke to the question of resilience in conflict management and healing in post-conflict. And of course, one of the fascinating things that is found in the literature is that the religious bodies, local congregations, religious actors are among the first and most effective responders. I guess I would push back to the panel this question of really digging into evidence and commitment to evidence as a strategy for grounding new relationships, new partnerships, and fuller engagement. And just invite your comment on that question.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, if we can, when you're dealing with either secular people or people who might even be condescending towards religion as more of a problem in the world than a solution, with people like that, evidence should play some kind of role. So if you can empirically demonstrate something that they may not be aware of, it will at least open them up to something that they would otherwise not know. So I mean, I think getting the evidence right is tremendously important. It's important that religious-based communities get their own theology right, though, too. And what I mean by that is the case for pluralism and freedom of conscience from a theological standpoint, let's talk about it from the Christian standpoint for a minute, usually goes like this. Everybody is created in the image of God. Therefore, there is inherent dignity there that nobody has the right to interfere with. A Christian who believes that does not have the right to interfere with an atheist or an agnostic or a person of another religion. So, ironically, it is when they are most faithful to that theological understanding about the dignity of human beings when the atheist and the agnostic and the other religion are most safe. And so, if we get our theology right, we actually, and also there's another part of our theology which should say, whether a person recognizes God or not, there is within them some kind of divine spark, a conscience. Very few people will deny this. If they are faithful to that conscience, and many good secular people are, they are an ally. They're not the enemy. They're not just some humanist or secular person. They are somebody responding to their best lights. And their own Christian theology can require of them an understanding of the other that is much more positive than you sometimes find. So if we can do that, we can create a place, a safe place for those who don't just think like we do.
I'll just add, I think the evidence-based approach is exactly the right one for trying to integrate religious freedom into other foreign policy interests and showing the way that religious freedom links with peace, security, economic development, democracy. I've been following the literature, at least informally for 8 years, and I will say that the vast majority of the evidence and statistics that I find is all done by one man, Brian Grimm, who most of us know. And what can we do to promote a greater body of work around? Can political scientists find what are the conditions under which these particular things happen, and in these particular places, if we're thinking about what interests are, speak most to certain populations, how does it work in particular places? I just think there's a lot more scholarly and statistical work to be done.
And with this evidence question, I think with the national security staff, what the chaplaincies are going to be bringing more and more is anecdotal evidence, after action reviews, what type of engagements we've had around the world. That's tangential, but it is some evidence we're doing.
Okay. I'm going to wrap us up with a couple stories and a couple conclusions. But back to evidence-based, we've had Brian speak at some of our programs in Vietnam and China. And we may not be able to solve this bigger picture stuff and structure and all those kinds of things that are out there. But when Brian speaks, what he basically does is he gives authoritarians permission to participate because he's presenting a neutral set of data. So I want you to encourage you to, A, use his data, but then think about how evidence-based stuff works in your own particular organization. Because what Brian's approach is, and he's a very strong religious freedom advocate, but he's also a strong freedom of inquiry, freedom of conscience guy. He says, here's the data, you decide. You tell me what your policy should be. And I've seen him speak on several different occasions in East Asia, and he never causes offense. Because at the end of the day, they know they've got to govern their people. And they've got to look for right solutions that are going to work, and they know that religion is an issue that's not going away. Second, I see Peter Kovac in the audience, and I want to tell a story about him in Pakistan, which will hopefully relate to my final 2 points. Even if it doesn't, it's good to tell a Peter Kovac story. Peter, if you don't know, is a retired Foreign Service officer, strong advocate of religious freedom, former director of the office before Victoria, who is over here about to become the DCM at the Vatican, now at NDU for a year. And IG had an opportunity to go to the AFPAC border a couple times between October 05 and May 06. And we've got some unique relations with the Deobandis there. In fact, the JUIF party, which is about to come back into power in the Northwest Frontier Province, now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And so we were there, and we were talking to people, and we were engaging the way we engage. And we came back and said, we've got a unique set of friends here. It'd be nice to share some of this information, find ways to work across, not the defense side, which is so obvious, but the diplomacy and the diplomatic side. And oh, by the way, I'm sure you know this, but there's a problem here. Every valley has its own radio. That's how the radicalization is taking place. Religion, like politics, is local, and they come together. And Peter says, I know. He was a public diplomacy guy. We've got to take that on. I said, so you've passed that up the chain of command? Yeah, I have. I said, so what's the response? I thought, man, I finally found somebody who's doing something, right? 6 years after 9/11. And the response to the idea of local radios radicalizing Muslim, Deobandi, Pashtun youth was get a bigger jammer. Wow. I can say that because he's now retired. In other words, we have no counter narrative. We're going to come at this with a two-dimensional linear solution, and we're going to jam their story, but we're not going to provide another story. And oh, by the way, we're basically uncomfortable with working with you, IGE, because you are faith-based and you're religious. Now, Peter wasn't uncomfortable, but that was the general feel when you went to the consulate in Peshawar and when you went down to IBAD and tried to meet with folks at our embassy. Now, that is changing, but it also gets into these 2 points that I'd like to conclude with, and back to the question about grand strategy. One is this: I don't think we're ever going to have a grand strategy. You say that just to aspire to something, but we're a democracy. That's just going to be the problem, unless there's a defining threat and we have containment. But we can have a grand culture. And I think that's what we need the most. In 1986, there was a thing called the Goldwater-Nichols Act. And it was a response to our failed missions in Iran in '81 and in '83 when the services couldn't communicate when they went into Grenada. Not exactly a powerhouse. And they said, you four services, Air Force, Marine, Navy, and who's the other one? Army. You're going to get to know each other, and the way we're going to do that, they jammed it down our throats, top down, is you're going to go get educated together, not trained together. Training is according to an accepted standard. Education is about how to think. And so we were in the classrooms together, and I went through a Monterey program, Naval Postgraduate School, with fellow, previously Army dogs, Air Force wing wipers, and Navy squids. I, of course, was a Marine jarhead. And that's where I began to understand that the cultures were broken down as we developed a common operating picture, as the military would say, a common culture of common terms. And that, I think, is the only thing that is going to guarantee synergy in the years ahead, is that we have to educate our interagency together. And what we're doing at NDU, we need to be doing at as many places as possible in the interagency world. You can't have partnerships unless you have a common culture with common terms of reference. And so the last and set point I will say is this, is what are some of those terms of reference and why were we successful in terms of engaging religious leaders who were political, back to Beth's question, at the center of our national security at the time, the AFPAC border? Well, we were not pluralistic. I don't like that term. Pluralistic suggests relativism to me, to my ear. We weren't secular either, which according to all my Muslim friends worldwide suggests there's no God, which is just, blasphemous. But we were about principled pluralism, which is to say we were about multi-faith engagement. And what I mean by that is we did not water down the differences between our faiths. Islam and Christianity, for example, especially in that part of the world, there's this much difference sometimes. But you know what? That difference is unbridgeable theologically. And I was able to say that to them, and I had that much more respect. And vice versa. We don't accept Jesus as the Son of God, but we believe in these common things of compassion, peace, justice, and mercy. There's a narrative that we should have been putting out over our own radios. While we jammed, by the way. Got to be both and. So you have to have a common culture, and those terms of reference I don't think can only come through education. Goldwater-Nichols Act was 1986. Most people define a generation as 23 years or so. We're since that time, and now there's a common terminology, joint education and training across the four services. And whether you like it or not, we think of each other as brothers and sisters. We like to poke fun when the others aren't around, but it's a common effort. We need something similar in the interagency, and we should include journalists in that education process, and we should include NGOs in that education process. That's where religious freedom can get integrated and religious respect can get integrated into a strategy because you have a common culture. The situation's always going to be different, especially in a world of state and non-state actors, and we don't know who the enemy is, and we don't know if we're at war. And the Geneva Conventions are not built for non-state engagement. But we can have that kind of common culture if we make a commitment to education. But that takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of money. But the common culture, meanwhile, is taking place through efforts like Gene's in the way we work and other NGOs work, because it's not a question of if, but when you will partner. So every partnership is a chance to demonstrate freedom and respect for the other partners' organizational culture and where they're coming from and their moral framework and motivation. But then secondly, you work together to face the global challenge that no one can do alone. So there's two chances to show freedom of mutual respect in the global age. In the process of partnership, and then in addressing the issue that you feel called to address. And if we can't get that right, this gets back to Kent's point, then we lose our identity. But you've got to know who you are theologically at your own richest and deepest best of your own faith in order to not tolerate but respect your neighbors. So with that, thank you for this conversation about basically what it means to be an American, to steward the citizenship across our foreign policy, across diplomacy, development, and defense. It's obviously an ongoing conversation. We welcome your feedback. And again, thanks to the John Templeton Foundation for making it all possible. Please join me one more time in thanking the panel for their presentation.